Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Toronto Community Benefit Network's fifth webinar focused on community benefits, building just and sustainable communities. Tonight, our focus is on community benefits, setting minimum targets, and other mechanisms to ensure compliance. We are delighted that you have chosen to spend the next hour or so with us and are confident that our speakers will provide you with good insights. My name is Matty. I'm a professor of geography and planning and the director of the Infrastructure Institute at the University of Toronto. As we get started, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. As this webinar is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. Toronto Community Benefit Network would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Indeed, Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also acknowledge the many broken promises and treaties and the need to work towards reconciliation with the original caretakers of Turtle Island, both in the present and for future generations. Let's acknowledge that the fight for community benefits builds on well-established practices with similar goals and principles, including over 300 privately negotiated enforceable agreements between Indigenous communities and developers known as impact benefit agreements. We are all treaty people. Indeed, up until 1961, over half of all Black people in Canada were Indigenous to Canada. Many of us came here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. We would like to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so we honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. This event is being brought to you tonight by a number of co-sponsors alongside the Toronto Community Benefit Network. I would like to acknowledge them now: the Canadian Urban Institute, York University City Institute, the University of Toronto School of Cities, City Build Ryerson, and the Atkinson Foundation. Thank you to our sponsors who have made this possible. Again, my name is Matty from the University of Toronto. Tonight's conversation comes at a pivotal moment. We are in a moment of intersecting crisis. And yet at the same time, we are in the midst of one of the biggest building booms in a generation. What happens now and in the next few years will shape our city and our country for generations to come, really for decades to come. And the question is, who is going to benefit from all of this growth and development? And how do we ensure that communities get their fair share and that the wealth that is being created now is spread equally and provides opportunities to all in our communities? This is really at the heart of what is being discussed tonight and the deep role that community benefits agreements have played in our cities. You see, the moment now and what it calls for through community benefit agreements is coming up with ways of codifying the benefits that we want projects to achieve so that this doesn't happen by chance. It's not left to a happenstance, but rather is intentionally negotiated through collaborations between multiple partners and multiple stakeholders. Tonight's conversation focuses on how we ensure that the agreements, once negotiated, actually achieve the benefits that are stated on paper. How do we turn a plan into action? This is the focus of tonight's conversation. Tonight we have speakers from a variety of different perspectives who will share their insights and experiences on how you take a community benefit agreement and you turn that into a living document and a plan for action that can be monitored and enforced. So before I pass it on to Rosemarie Powell for today's session, I want to cover just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. This webinar will be posted on the TCBN's website for future use. Feel free to promote this series, use it in your classroom and training. We hope that it becomes a living resource for people interested in building more inclusive economies and societies. There will be time for Q&As towards the end of today's event. If you'd like to submit a question during the session, please enter it into the chat or Q&A function at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Everyone will be manually muted during today's event. You can follow and post about the event on social media by using the hashtag Inclusive Recovery. Now I would like to introduce the Executive Director of the Toronto Community Benefits Network, Rosemarie Powell, who will act as facilitator for this webinar. Rosemarie, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Matty. It is great to see you today, and I am so pleased to be in the same space with all these community benefits champions who are standing with us on the platform for community benefits. You know, Professor Matty, he's a very humble person, and so he doesn't share his impressive bio with you. I've relied on him for maybe too many times already for his expertise. And I hope you'll always pick up the phone for me, though, from time to time, despite all of that. Let me share with you his bio. Professor Matty Simateki is director of the Infrastructure Institute and professor of geography and planning at the University of Toronto. His work focuses on delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, evidence-based infrastructure investment decisions, and the effective integration of infrastructure into the fabric of cities. His recent studies explore transit policy decisions, the value for money of public-private partnerships, the development of innovative mixed-use building as a form of place-based infrastructure policy, and the diversity gap in the infrastructure industry workforce. Professor Matty consults widely on infrastructure policy and is a frequent media commentator on infrastructure and city planning. And we're just so pleased to have him with us today, and the wealth of expertise that he brings to this community benefits movement is just so valuable. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Rosemarie.
Okay, and so yes, here we are at our 5th webinar session. Happy New Year to everyone. 2022 is already shaping up to be very consequential for community benefits this year. We have the ICI collective bargaining process that is happening provincially. We have both a provincial and municipal elections that is coming up very soon. And of course, TCBN is going full steam ahead with our strategic planning process, where we're going to be looking at the future of community benefits in Toronto for the next 5 years. And we hope all of you who are on the call with us today is going to really be able to contribute into that. Of course, plus we have our Building Diversity Awards Gala, which is happening on May 12th, just looking at how do we continue to encourage and to recognize the industry, unions and contractors and individuals and champions like yourselves who are leading on community benefit and ensuring equity, diversity, and inclusion in the construction industry. You know, so with all of this in mind, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to be having this conversation now. How do we make sure the needs of those who are most vulnerable in our communities stay front and center in the hearts and minds of our decision makers when all of this chaos is happening around us? Here we are going into the 3rd year of a pandemic. The issues that we've been fighting for as a community didn't start with the pandemic, but it was surely laid bare for everyone to see. How do we ensure that the massive taxpayer investment in infrastructure development benefits the local communities and address some of the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our economy that we're looking at? So today's topic is all about setting minimum targets and other mechanisms to ensure compliance. And we have 4 panelists who has deep experience doing this work. And we will I will introduce them to you one at a time and ask for them to make a presentation about their work. And then we'll bring them all together on a panel, and then we'll have a conversation. And if you have any questions as we go through this session tonight, please put them in the chat, and I will try to get to as much of them as possible. We're going to try to end by 7 p.m. tonight. We might go over up to 7:15 at the very latest. So let me introduce the panelists. They are April Lim, Policy Development Officer at the City of Toronto, Alicia Mason, Social Planner, Community Economic Development at the City of Vancouver, Pino Damasio, Head of Impact and Strategy at DREAM, and William Mendes, who is the Director of Program Delivery at the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. I am going to start with April Lynn and ask her to be our first presenter. April?
Thanks, Rosemary.
Okay, wonderful. Let me just read out April's bio so you understand the depth of information and knowledge that she brings with her today. So April is a Policy Development Officer at the City of Toronto. In her 11 years at the City of Toronto, April has played various roles in research, policy development, and data trend analysis, highlighting and addressing inequitable system barriers faced by equity-deserving communities. Most recently, April's policy work has focused on ways to leverage public infrastructure investments to create training, employment, and business opportunities for targeted communities. She's a leader in developing the City of Toronto's approach to community benefits, including the Community Benefits Framework, Rexdale Casino Woodbine, Community Benefits Agreement, and the Social Procurement Program of the city. When she's not working, April loves to be outdoors year-round in nature with her partner, 3 children, and a dog. April.
Thanks, Rosemary. Good evening, everyone. I was asked to speak briefly about how government contracts could be used to achieve community benefits goals and objectives. In particular, once community benefits objectives are agreed to in a contract, how do we ensure compliance? We all know that community benefits clauses without clear authority to enforce them are of minimal value. And for this reason, the cornerstone of the City of Toronto's approach to community benefits focuses on using the city's strongest enforcement mechanisms or levers, and they are implemented in the form of legally binding contracts. Endorsed by Toronto City Council in 2019 and 2021, the Community Benefits Framework was developed through extensive research and review. We also conducted in-depth consultation with community partners and key stakeholders, including TCBN and many of the organizations in attendance today. Next slide, please. The City of Toronto approach enables community benefits compliance. To date, the city's community benefits have mostly focused on service, construction, and lease agreements, which are typically awarded through procurement processes like RFPs and tenders. And though less common, there have been other types of agreements also. So with an enforceable city contract in hand, we then insert community benefits clauses that use clear definitions and measurable hard targets to be explicit on what community benefits must be achieved by the various parties. And for select place-based projects, community groups play a critical role in identifying community priorities and setting local hiring targets. We then set out on a regular schedule for monitoring and oversight. This ensures progress reports are submitted and reviewed on time. It also allows for real-time problem solving where needed. And again, community groups can play roles in monitoring and oversight for select place-based projects. And throughout this process, collaboration across community, government, labor, and employment partners are critical to achieving success. Next slide. There are several different community benefits initiatives at the City of Toronto, and each are slightly different from one another. As an example, the city's social procurement program uses contracts that are awarded through procurement processes like RFPs and tenders. Awarded contracts primarily contain service or construction requirements, but then community benefits clauses with hard targets are added in. And in order to monitor and oversee implementation, regular meetings and progress reports are scheduled and must be complied with. Next slide. While the original theme for this webinar is minimum hard targets and compliance, I'd like to suggest we may be overlooking a critical piece of this conversation. Are hard targets and enforcement mechanisms enough to achieve compliance? We use project-based hard targets at the City of Toronto. We use equity-focused community benefits clauses in enforceable city contracts. We dedicate city staff resources to oversee those contracts, and we do all of this in collaboration with community labor and employment partners. So hard targets, enforceable contracts, sustainable resources, and collaboration with stakeholders. These are pillars of a progressive, equity-focused community benefits policy. That's a significant win for equity-deserving communities and for all people in Toronto. But where we're falling behind is on the implementation know-how that will move us from the so what of community benefits to the now what. It's time to put the plan into action. Building that back-end implementation infrastructure is a shared problem that promises shared wins and outcomes. For example, we need contractors and developers to forecast the labor demands for each project in detail in order for training centers and programs to prepare targeted candidates well in advance of these hiring opportunities. We need to ensure wraparound supports are available to maximize job retention and career development. We also need to collect disaggregated data and track new hires on a project-by-project basis so that we can conduct longitudinal data analysis that speaks to the broader social and economic impact of these initiatives. The unique challenge that we face at the City of Toronto is the scale of this endeavor. The City of Toronto's ambition is to develop protocols and processes that can be shared across the city's many different projects and initiatives. And the range of key partners and stakeholders around the proverbial table is massive. And so too, at times, are the conflicting interests. Enabling compliance requires much more than hard targets alone. It calls on us to work together in deep collaboration to move from the current state into the future desired state. And if we want to catapult community benefits to the next level, we need to be talking more about the implementation how-tos. So this slide here highlights some of the work we're doing in collaboration with that range of community, labor, and employment partners. We're developing and piloting new prototypes and models through a phased approach, and we cannot do this work alone. The opportunities to create equitable economic development for Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities are enormous. The City of Toronto is excited and humbled to be part of this innovative work with TCBN, with many of you, and for the long haul. Thank you, Rosemary and TCBN, for the invitation to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, April. Let's go to our next panelist, Alicia Mason. She is a social planner in community economic development at the City of Vancouver, where part of her portfolio focuses on implementing the city's community benefits agreement policy. Prior to working for the city, Alicia has worked over 10 years in Vancouver's downtown east side, starting with frontline social service work in the housing, health, and mental health sectors. More recently, Alicia was the acting director at Exchange Inner City, a membership-based organization that implements community economic development projects in Vancouver's downtown east side. Alicia also works as the manager of community engagement for Bi-Social Canada. It was through her work at Exchange Inner City and Bi-Social Canada that she first came to learn about community benefits agreements and was involved in advocating for and supporting the development of the city's CBA policy. Alicia, join us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rosemary, so much for that introduction. And it's great to be here. And thank you again for inviting myself and as a representative of the City of Vancouver to talk about our CBA policy today and to specifically talk about how we're implementing that policy and measuring and ensuring compliance. So if we can go straight to my slides, that would be great. Thank you. And you can go right to the next slide. And if you can just keep clicking, sorry, they're kind of automatic things that come through. Thanks so much, Kumsa. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the City of Vancouver's Community Benefit Agreement policy. Our policy has been developed over several years with many pilots previous to it actually being approved by Council in September of 2018. But we certainly didn't get to where we are today without deep collaboration, as April was speaking of. So collaboration with many community groups, with development industry, construction industry, other cities, so also learning from Toronto and elsewhere to be able to get where we are today. And so to talk about where we are and how the Vancouver CBA policy applies, we have two processes. So one, we have a mandatory community benefit agreement policy, and this is applied to any new development projects that come through the City of Vancouver through our rezoning process. So if those rezoning applications come through and they are 45,000 square meters or more in gross floor area, then they will be required to apply our community benefit agreement process. And through that mandatory process, it is required that the developers show best efforts to achieve compliance targets, and the permits can be withheld for non-compliance. And so permits include both the rezoning approval and enactment, and then further into development permits, building permits, and occupancy permits. When developers do go through our mandatory community benefit agreement policy, they do receive a number of recognition pieces from the City of Vancouver, including information on our website, social media, signage, and more. Our other process is a voluntary process, and this is where developers have the opportunity to opt in and do a community benefit agreement policy on their projects if they decide that that is something they're interested in trying out. If it's a value perhaps of their organization and the general contractors that they might be working with to create community benefits where their development is happening. And so this can be done on any projects that have a gross floor area of 10,000 square meters to just up to 45,000 square meters. And again, we love to recognize these developers for doing these projects. Next slide. So what are our compliance requirements for the City of Vancouver's Community Benefit Agreement policy? We have three different requirement targets. The first being that developers need to hire local and equity seeking groups. And the target specifically is that 10% of all new jobs in both construction and in post-occupancy are required to go to local and equity seeking groups. By local, we have a definition that spans to the most geographic location in which the development is being built in. So we think about the neighborhood of where it's being built in as the first local, most local piece. Then we look to our city core, which are neighborhoods within the City of Vancouver that have high rates of folks experiencing poverty, of folks who may be considered equity-seeking groups, and looking to hire from those areas. And then it branches out across the city, then the Lower Mainland or Metro Vancouver, and then the province. We also have local and social procurement targets, and these targets are also applied during construction phase as well as during the occupancy phase or operations phase of the building. And again, it's a 10% of procurement spend. So this is on the total value of the project. 10% of procurement needs to go to local and social businesses. Both the local and social procurement targets can be met as one target if that is the case in some of these situations. So oftentimes we have local social enterprises that developers may work with to meet these targets. Next slide. So how is the city's community benefit agreement policy implemented? So we have a 6-step process in which we do this. So as I said, it starts out during rezoning. So when developers come through and look to have land rezoned to build their new development projects, the city will notify the developer of a mandatory community benefit agreement if the gross floor area of that project is over 45,000 square meters. If you're not a square meter type of person, that's 484,375 square feet. Second, the developer then must sign a community benefit agreement prior to rezoning enactment. So we have a community benefit agreement template with those compliance targets that I just shared with you, all written out with all of the legalese agreements completed within that. And that is given to the developers to review and sign before their rezoning can be enacted and approved and before they can move into the development permit application process. So prior to issuance of building permits, the developer must produce a plan showing how they will achieve the community benefit agreement compliance targets. So this is where we begin to come in and speak with them and say, okay, you signed the community benefit agreement, now what? How are you going to start to do this work? Here's some resources available to you to support you to meet those employment and procurement targets. And let's chat and move into step 4, which is that the city developer and the developer's third-party monitor will set up a specific project-specific working group. And that's where we really work together in that deep collaborative way to support meeting the CBA compliance targets and also receive progress updates. And it's also where we work through some of the challenges, as we know that sometimes our local workforce or supply chains aren't always available or have the capacity at times to meet the demands of some of these large projects. So we need to know and talk about these challenges way in advance of the possible demands coming down the line, so that we can help build the capacity of our community and our local suppliers and employment agencies and local residents to be able to meet these opportunities that will be available through these projects. And the key thing there in the 4th step too is that third-party monitor role. So it's in our agreements that we require developers to hire their own third-party monitor in order to monitor and report on that developer meeting the CBA compliance targets. And then we move through phase 5 and throughout all phases, including both the rezoning, development, building, and post-occupancy, the developer will work with their third-party monitor to ensure compliance. So this is a very important step. And then lastly, we have regular annual reporting from the developer and their third-party monitor to the City of Vancouver to see how they are meeting those compliance targets, any issues that arise, and be able to continue to monitor and report on how our community benefit agreements truly are benefiting folks in our local community. Are we creating more inclusive and equitable economies through this CBA tool and process? Next slide. And then we do have one other piece where we really do some of that deep collaboration work and look to our workforce development and our local supply chains to really support these projects to be successful in meeting our community benefit agreement policy compliance targets. And that group is called the Citywide Community Benefit Agreement Working Group. It's a group made of experts across the development industry, construction industry, local community networks, similar to Toronto Community Benefit Network. So we have a group called Exchange Intercity on board, by Social Canada to bring that social procurement and social enterprise perspective, some local social enterprises, Vancouver Economic Commission. So folks that all have in some way or another connections to the CBA projects or to the opportunities that may become available, and can look to ways to build the capacity of our local workforce development and supply chains. And so you can see listed here, we have a number of priorities that we've worked out with this Citywide Community Benefit Agreement Working Group. Just by hearing what we're learning from projects to date, particularly we're working on the new development for the St. Paul's Hospital, but we've worked on previous projects as well. And so using information from current and past projects, and also directly from the community and the residents themselves to hear what is needed so that our community and our local supply chains really do have the capacity or can build up their capacity and have what they need to respond to the opportunities that come through our community benefit agreement policies. Next slide. So I'll leave it there for now. That's all from me, but thank you very much again for having me here today. And I really look forward to the ongoing discussion and questions.
Wow, Alicia and April, you have stimulated a lot of interest so far. I'm seeing questions in the chat and in the question and answer feature. Everyone, please continue to put your questions there. I will make sure that I get to as many of them as possible. We just provided, April and Alicia from two major city or municipality perspectives. And, which is really good. And I'm sure we're going to have even more questions for them. But now I want to move to a contractor perspective, industry perspective. And with Pinot first, before we then move on to the Toronto Community Housing. So Pinot Damasio is the head of impact strategy and delivery at DREAM. Pinot is responsible for the execution of DREAM's impact pathways, which includes delivering measurable positive outcomes for specific social and environmental goals throughout the company's portfolio. Pinot also works to identify opportunities with external stakeholders and community partners to further advance DREAM's impact initiatives and broader community objectives. With over 25 years of experience in planning and development, Pinot has led and shaped some of the most complex and impactful urban projects in Canada and beyond. Pinot.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thanks for having me here. And thanks for everyone who's shown up at the webinar. If we go to the next slide and start this, as Rosemary mentioned, I think my invitation here was to give a private sector perspective on community benefits, and I'm going to be really focusing on social procurement, partly because we spent a good part of last year actually developing our social procurement strategy at DREAM. And as Rosemary said, is my role there is really to help us implement our general overall impact strategy. And if we go to the next slide, please. DREAM is a real estate company. We're Canadian based. We're in Toronto. We've got land holdings across the country in various places. We're in the United States. We're in Northern Europe as well. So we have a lot of real estate assets that we are owning, we're fixing up, we're managing. Some are under development, and some are just being managed. And part of developing a social procurement strategy was in line with our focus as an impact-focused company. And what that means is that in addition to focusing on strong financial returns, we also focus on having social and environmental impacts through the management of real estate. And that is really to address a number of important societal issues. So we have both, we are a for-profit company, and we have a strong social purpose. Our focus is on impact on three main areas, one being environmental sustainability, one being a second being the increase of affordable housing and the provision of affordable housing, and a third one being on helping build inclusive communities. It's this focus on inclusivity and inclusive communities that led us to work on a social procurement strategy, because we really see that as a mechanism, not just to make sure that the communities we build are diverse, but that in the building of the communities, we actually provide opportunities for a diversity of businesses to take part in that, and a diversity of people to actually work on those. So if we move to the next slide, this is just a basic definition of what we mean by social procurement. Sorry if it's not that readable for people, depending on what kind of screen you're looking at. I'm happy to put a link to our strategy in the chat after I'm done. But effectively, social procurement, we don't see it as anything that should cost a private company any extra money. It's simply the spending and the directing of money, and the spending and the direction of our spending power on real estate towards a specific social good. In our case, we've defined social procurement much in the same way as I heard April and Alicia describe their strategies and policies at Toronto and Vancouver. We're focused on one, job opportunities for diverse and equity-seeking groups. We're focused on business opportunities, both for businesses that are majority owned by equity-seeking groups, as well as local and independent businesses. And as a land development company, always focused on reconciliation as well. We have a very specific objective, on working with Indigenous communities in the places where we work to make sure that these objectives are also flowing through to those communities. So that's the overall general kind of definition of what we mean by social procurement. As I said, we developed a company-wide policy independent of community benefits agreements, which we are doing, to apply to our various businesses. And next slide, please. Why did we do this? Some of it is its alignment with our impact strategy, alignment with our objectives, and our desire to show quantitative outcomes in what we're doing, and specifically related to inclusivity. It's partly related to leadership that we want to show within the industry on what we can do, what we should be doing, ways to address larger societal issues. The most important one on the list that I want to address, because it kind of gets to one of the I think one of the points to the talk today is around intentionality, right? We're going to be successful if we do these things intentionally. And part of having a strategy is not just to enter into a contract and start producing the results or numbers or quantifying them, but actually to have a desire to actually want to do this, and that's what we try to do with much of our impact initiatives, is really purposefully and intentionally set out to do something. So what are we doing? This is the target side. Next slide, please. We tried to keep it very, very simple, but we also, I think, are very, very ambitious in our targets. We basically have divided them into two main objectives, one around business opportunities. And there we have set a target for 20% of the contract value that we initiate on real estate projects to go to businesses that are owned by majority equity seeking groups, and 20% that go to local independent businesses or socially responsible businesses. So those are on the actual business side of it and the procurement of contracts. On the job side of it, we have a 20% target in terms of the jobs being created, and that is something we have to work with contractors in terms of quantifying and reporting on. But that's 20% of all the jobs created on our projects would go to individuals who are identified from equity-seeking groups. I don't think you can see it on the slide here, but we also have a very specific apprenticeship and training objective, which is slightly higher at 30%. And I think if part of what we're doing is creating the opportunities for meaningful participation by groups who are underrepresented, we have to make sure that there are training opportunities and apprenticeship opportunities for those individuals so that they can step into roles moving forward. So those are our targets. Next slide, please. I think April, made the point that, targets aren't everything and we can't just rely on them. There's actually a lot of social infrastructure we have to do to support a community benefits agreement or a general social procurement strategy. I've kind of got some listed here. This is kind of the hard work, right? Setting targets is hard in terms of coming up with a number that's meaningful, a number that you think is going to have impact. But then doing the work, whether it is surveys of all our existing suppliers, which we're doing now, whether it's working on contract language related to bid documents and contract documents to make sure that you're able to enforce some of your strategy, or that you're achieving it, or that you actually have good information on, are you actually giving business, are you hiring people from different groups through different projects. So a lot of that is some of the legwork that we're doing. Annual reporting and tracking is something we'll be working on as well. I think the supporting of the vendors is very, very important. And that's both in terms of supporting businesses who want to bid on projects and put them in a position to be competitive, as well as supporting businesses who are going to deliver on some of the jobs that form part of the strategy, and facilitating that for them, which probably means a lot of work on networking, on organizational building, on collaboration, whether it is with municipal partners, nonprofit partners, employment agencies, in terms of making all the connections that are required to achieve the targets. Final slide then is really kind of sort of the summary of what we're doing, and I'm not going to focus. Next slide, please. I'm not going to focus on the summary of the actual strategy, because I think I was pretty succinct in speaking about it, but rather just want to make point. Next slide, please. Maybe it's stuck. Just really make point here is the targets and the numbers are one thing. What we're finding is again, with the intentionality of what we're trying to do, the success is not, I think, in meeting targets, but is in actually watching some of our work turn into large contracts for some of the businesses we're dealing with. So out in Ottawa, we have a project called ZB. It's probably our largest community benefits, overall kind of project. We have a friendship agreement there with the Algonquins. And that's resulted in quite a bit of work to different companies and hiring, but specifically to DeConti, that's an Algonquin construction company, an Algonquin-owned construction company there. We've been able to provide billions of dollars of contracts towards. And this year, as we were testing and piloting some of our implementation mechanisms for our social procurement strategy, we used a renovation of a downtown office building in Toronto to test, the putting out of our contract bids and documents, actually specifically seeking equity-seeking business or equity businesses that were owned by equity-seeking groups, as well as employment targets within it. And through that, we were able to give a contract to 360 Demo, which is a Black-owned demolition company in Toronto. So it's watching those, I think, things happen are going to be the successes that we're dealing with. And one of the ways to, I think one of the strong ways to measure whether what we're doing is being effective and impactful. And with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Rosemary.
Well, thank you, Pino. I can feel the energy in the room right now. I know that there is a lot of people with a lot of questions, and we're hoping to be able to dig into it. Our time is going, but I think we'll definitely spend the full time that we allocated today so that we can really take some more time with each of the panelists here. So our final panelist is William Mendes, and he is the Director of Program Delivery with the Toronto Community Housing Development Division. He's played various roles in TCHC to lead teams in the design and implementation of social and economic transformation initiatives. A major focus of his work is supporting social housing residents get connected to meaningful educational, employment training, and entrepreneurial opportunities through partnerships with developers, trade unions, employers, and community networks. And I'm really looking forward to his particular perspective on this. I know, especially in our community benefits movement, housing has been a major issue, a major challenge, and can't wait to hear from William in terms of what the city of the Toronto Community Housing is doing as it relates to community benefit.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, and good evening, everyone. Can we just please go to the next slide? So at Toronto Community Housing, we have 8 active revitalization sites. This is just a snapshot of the aerial views of some of the buildings. Not the most important thing, but if we can go to the next slide. Our revitalization sites are spread across the city of Toronto, and there's a variety of agreements that we've been able to secure with our developer partners, and they range from securing 10% hiring and best efforts to secure employment locally, or for TCHC tenants to secure those employment opportunities, all the way to hard targets as to 40 jobs or 100 jobs secured through the developer and or their networks. We've actually in more recent times pivoted to using a dollar valuation. So for example, over here, you can see Lawrence Heights has a valuation of $4 million in employment, training, and scholarships. And what this provides is a level of accountability with the developer partner to achieve a target. So every employment position or job secured by a TCHC resident counts towards that $4 million value. And if a person earns X amount in wages, it is credited towards that and deducted from the $4 million target. And in the event that a developer does not achieve the target by the prescribed deadline, there's the opportunity to provide cash in lieu to Toronto Community Housing from the developer to ensure that the total value of that tenant benefit is still secured, and TCHC will receive that money and then reinvest it in economic development programs and initiatives to support the community. So that is one way that we've been able to ensure compliance, as well as ensure that the agreed upon investment stays true to the community. And altogether, inclusive of employment opportunities, training, scholarships, social investments, and some capital investments in community facilities and other facilities in a revitalization, approximately over $100 million has been secured as part of benefits for our revitalization sites. And if we can go to the next slide. And in terms of actually developing the tenant benefit plan and working with developers, we use a slightly different approach where we consult with the community prior to engaging, where we can, engaging with the developer to create the agreement itself. And this is very important, where we are working with our tenants and understanding what the challenges are, what the needs are, what the aspirations, and really understanding what those priorities are. That information, such as whether it's community safety, affordable housing, economic development, youth services, social services, and access to different spaces, we take that and use that information to inform our planning and design goals and inform what the community benefit plan should look like. We also share this information with our developers as they respond to our RFP, and we've been fortunate enough to actually involve the community in the selection of, or the scoring of, community or tenant benefit proposals from the developers, which creates a different level of accountability and different level of relationship directly with the community and the developer. And it also gets the developer to better understand what type of needs the community is looking to be addressed as part of a revitalization. We also ensure that any of the agreed upon outcomes or targets that are created with the developer is secured within our procurement process, and is not an agreement that is outside of that procurement agreement. So we ensure that it's legally binding, and we also build into the process, into that legally binding agreement, what the tracking, monitoring, reporting, and evaluation framework will be. So that way all parties have an understanding, including the community, as to how we're going to report out the progress towards the targets, how we're going to communicate that out, how we're going to evaluate the success and the social impact that's derived from the investments. And it's important for us to engage our communities, mainly because in our 8 revitalization sites, there's about 13,000 people who live in those sites, and 50% of them are within the working age, and the average individual income is about $20,000 a year, and that's quite low. And what our tenant benefit initiatives aim to do is support everyone living within the sites to access more meaningful opportunities, services, and services to attain a better quality of life that is directed by their own individual goals. So I think that's all that I have for right now, and really look forward to our question and answer period. So I'd like to turn it back over to you, Rosemary.
Thank you, Will. Could you please stay on video, and I invite April and Alicia and Pinot to also come on video. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. And so, yes, there's a lot of questions for you. I have one myself. You've answered a lot of the questions that I had before, but I'm just kind of sensing that, 10 years ago, it was an uphill battle for the TCBN and many community leaders in our local communities across the city to get government or industry to take community benefits seriously. Do you get a sense that it's starting to change? Are we at a tipping point yet? Will we ever get there? I mean, we have a 10%, from the city of Vancouver to the city of Toronto. 10% was 10 years ago. Now I'm hearing from Pino that, as a private company, he's at 20%. When can we get to like 50% at the city of Toronto, reflecting the diversity of what this, the city actually looks like? Are we there yet? What will it take? Any one of you, please jump in.
I can start off with just saying, like, over the 14 years that I've been at Toronto Community Housing, I know the response from our developers yes, there's minimum targets set, but they're actually in healthy competition with one another to exceed those expectations, and the willingness from the developer community is definitely there. And it is really a function of the recognition that society has put on being more than just a capital investment firm and a real estate investment or a developer, like the traditional developer. And that pressure or recognition definitely goes a long way, because the developers that we've worked with have worked very hard to achieve some goals and, more importantly, exceed them. So I'd just like to start off with that, which I think it is working. And over to Pinot. Yeah.
Sure, I'll give maybe a very simple answer in that there's probably two things, right? One is, as we do more of this and we collect baseline data, we'll have more more courage maybe to have bolder targets, or to know what's reachable or what's not. I know in developing ours, that was always a big question, which is well, is that target reachable? If you always worry if a target's reachable, you're probably going to be too low. So part of it is being bold. The second one is, the more contracts and agreements are entered into, and especially on the public side, that they require them, the better we all get at building them and doing them, right? Because once once it becomes a requirement to bid on a project, then you put your efforts towards doing it and meeting that.
Thank you. April, I see that you have you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I might answer the question with another question, which is, where is there when we say, are we there yet, right? I think that there is actually many different stops along the way. And if we don't acknowledge all of the wins that have been gained and achieved by all the different stakeholders to get to where we're going in like the long journey, then we would be remiss to acknowledge them. Like bringing together all of the stakeholders to the same table to address some of these really sticky issues, that's a win. Having conversations very openly with unions and labor and contractors, bringing together people that have conflicting interests to say, hey, what are our common shared goals and objectives, and how are we going to get there? That's a win. Adopting policy in the cities, the largest city in Canada that speaks to community benefits as a requirement, not as an option, that's a huge win. So I think that the wins need to be acknowledged along the way, that they're not only about the hard targets, but they're about much, much more in addition to those hard targets.
I could not agree with you anymore, April. Alicia.
Yeah, this is a great question. And similar to what Will said, we're actually seeing here in the city of Vancouver that mostly more of our recent projects, so the previous project prior to our policy being passed and the current one undergoing our policy are are meeting beyond the 10% targets for both employment and procurement. So folks might have heard before about the Park Vancouver Casino project, which was the pilot project that helped us to design our current CBA policy. And that project actually exceeded the 10% employment target and met a 22% target in employment, and continues to exceed that target throughout its operations. And then for procurement, they've been either just meeting 10% or exceeding slightly over at about 11%, 12%, and that is continuing throughout. But what we're seeing from these projects, and as Will and every like Pinot and other folks have said here, we need to continue to have these projects go through these targets we have set now, collect that data, and then we have more information to be more bold and increase those targets. And that's exactly what our council has asked us to do. So part of our process as city staff is that we have to go back to our city council and report publicly on how our CBA policy actually creating benefits and impacting folks in our local community, creating inclusive employment, accessible employment, and particularly making employment available for equity-seeking groups. And so when we go back to share how these projects are meeting these targets and exceeding them, we can then have that opportunity at council to say, we can go beyond 10% now. Let's try 20 or 25 or whatever it might be, and have that opportunity to make those changes with our policy. So we go back to council every 2 years to provide those reports and see how we can continue to improve our policy and make it impactful.
Awesome, thank you. I want to go now to some audience question, and the people on this call, I got to tell you, and throughout our series, are people who are deeply committed to this work of community benefits. So they know the ins and outs. So they're asking some really piercing questions, and I'm going to take the first person who put their question officially in the Q&A, and this is Sharon Simpson, who, by the way, is one of the co-founders of the Toronto Community Benefits Network. She was there in the trenches from day one. She asked to April specifically, and I think anyone can answer. You can answer to Alicia, especially seeing that it's a city question. Do you think that a city is the best entity for monitoring implementation?
I think I can go first, and then Alicia, if you want to add in. Thanks so much for your question, Sharon. I think that, again, it depends. I think that monitoring implementation can refer to a wide range of different projects and initiatives, and the scale changes. Some projects are far larger than others. Some are significantly place-based in a local neighborhood or area, whereas others are, at the City of Toronto, for example, could be a service procurement contract that's not really place-based, but rather very transactional, but still has equity opportunities. So I think that, first and foremost, yes, community, other stakeholders can bring a lot of insight value to being part of the monitoring process. As, for example, with Rexdale CBA, we have a community steering committee that has a wide range of community labor and employment folks at the table, including TCBN. So yeah, I think that it really depends, and there are a lot of different ways in which the city can monitor different contracts in collaboration with a lot of its partners.
Thank you, April. Alicia?
Yeah, my answer to this would be yes and no. And I think that's exactly why the City of Vancouver has, as part of our implementation process, included the third-party monitor to support implementation and monitoring of community benefit agreements, so that they're a group that's removed from the development side, removed from us as a city, to be their own neutral party to really report on this and have that true accountability built into the monitoring and reporting of these projects. But then in addition to that, similar to what April is saying, we've built out these project-specific working groups that meet monthly with the developer, general contractors, third-party monitor. And then we bring in community employment agencies and anybody who may have, that relates to these projects or could benefit from these projects. We bring them in as needed and as the opportunities arise to share information about the work that they can provide, the employees they have at the ready and trained and available, the supply chains and social enterprises that can meet the demands of these projects. That third-party monitor plays that role to bring these folks in as needed, and say, hey, you've got this coming down the pipe, we can do that for you. And they get to play that piece in monitoring this project to make sure that those benefits are coming to them. And then we've got that citywide CBA working group, which is another stakeholder group of industry experts and folks in community and people who identify as equity seeking groups, local business, social enterprises. They can all then continue to monitor how these CBA projects across the city, so not just specific projects, but all of them, are they really meeting benefits, these community benefits? Is it impacting the people that we want it to impact? And how can us as community together build the capacity so that it does? And so they get to monitor that and the full-on implementation of our policy. And they also get to advocate on how our policy should change and bring those changes forward along with us as the city to council when we go to them.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to get to all of the questions tonight, but I see a lot coming in. I'm curious, Pino, here is a question from Alicia Mason, who's doing some amazing work in her local community over there in Scarborough. And she's asking about, there is great value in quickly sharing your great experiences to ensure others who may not be able to assess cost benefit and to do risk analysis. I think I'd like to hear from from you, Pino. Would you appreciate your experience being shared more widely in order to continue raise reachable targets, as you say? My interest there in that question is the cost benefit and risk analysis. How do you go about doing that, Pino?
It's cost benefit and risk analysis is kind of, what are you comfortable with as a company taking on as an objective in terms of doing it. I think when it comes to an individual community benefits agreement, you'd have to look at what your partner, because an agreement has a partner, whether it's the municipality, whether it's TCHC, whether whether it's another public agency, and you have to assess what given the risk of the project, how big of a commitment can you make, and are you going to be able to meet what's being asked of you, right? Or if you go above it, what are the financial penalties for doing that? So I think that's kind of an individual thing that people have to assess. I think what we're trying to do to help others, I think is a couple things. Is one, being out there first, one, publishing our targets, having annual progress reports. So I will tell you next year how close we are to meeting 20%. And if we've already hit it, then we should be increasing it. And if we're far off, we should be doing a lot of work, right? And sharing that. The other big one that we want to do is we're upfront, and being upfront means we are making many of the connections with different businesses. And one of the things we've promised is in the companies that work with us, having an open database that others can see. So if they're looking for contractors who are capable of doing work, I think it's of benefit to know, they delivered successfully with Dream, right? We will help publish information about those companies so that they're out there in other places. And I think that kind of partnership building is the way kind of we help each other as an industry. And we're also going to look at our public sector partners to do the same, right? So as we enter into contractual arrangements to provide these things, which some projects will require, that we benefit from, the great work that April and Alicia are doing on contractor suppliers that they've already worked with.
Well, thank you, Pino. Now, labor and workforce development is a huge component of a community benefits agreement. And I want to ask a question about that from one of our audience members, but there is another part of community benefits that often gets overlooked: the neighborhood and environmental improvements aspects. And so I want to go back to Sharon, even though we had a question from her before, because I think this is a good one. And it's directly asking William. Does the tenant benefits include such things as investment in hardscapes, such as art for beautification? What other types of community benefits other than workforce development or social procurement are you also doing with TCH?
So we have public art, environmental sustainability, meaning meeting the City of Toronto's green standards and trying to surpass those standards, are not part of our valuation of community benefits. They are a direct benefit to society and to our world, but we're not including them as part of it. These are governed, the way we've looked at it so far, are governed by different other policies. So we haven't enabled developers to include that as part of their community benefit or tenant benefit proposals as part of our selection processes. But it's very much a major focus of ours, and some exciting work will be coming out this year and next year around our environmental standards. So
I think there's a lot of people on this call who are eagerly awaiting and looking forward to some neighborhood and environmental benefits from different community benefits agreements. And I think definitely TCH could be a leader in that area. So stay tuned, everybody. William says some things are coming in the next year or so. All right. Going back to the question around workforce development, then I have an anonymous attendee asking, how do you determine which specific trades are in demand and the volume of skilled trades workers needed on a trade by trade basis? That is an Achilles heel, I think, for some of our community benefits projects. Who wants to answer that? Alicia? April?
Sure, I'm happy to answer and kick us off.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so how we identify that is through these projects that we're implementing the CBA policy on, but also by listening to our community and our industry stakeholders. So our construction industry stakeholders, our employment agencies, our social enterprises, the residents themselves. And then as we go through these projects and we see challenges or we see opportunities for, we need, 1,000 plumbers or something, let's say in 3 years from now. And we know that there's a shortage of plumbers available in our local community. We then turn to our employment agencies and our different training centers and our residents to find out how can we support building the capacity of folks to become plumbers, to access these trainings as much as possible, and to build capacity of folks to be available and ready to be plumbers in 3 years' time. To then meet those opportunities down the line. So it's definitely something we don't do alone, and it requires us to go out and do a lot of direct engagement, a lot of listening, and hearing what is needed so that the demands that will come from these projects can actually be met by our own community.
Well, thank you very much. I do want to give Professor Matty enough time to wrap up because we do end the call at 7:15. So I'm just going to ask one last question coming from Christy Kilborn. Do the social enterprises, community groups, developers, etc., have capacity issues that would impact their participation as we ramp up a CBA implementation? How do we build capacity in community? Anna. Good question to, let's see, who do we want to ask this to? April?
Sure, I'm just reading over the question here to see what's being asked.
How do we build capacity in community? Are there capacity issues from these community groups and social enterprises that we really need to address? And William, I see you looking like you're ready to answer this.
Yeah, this is so when we talk about the hard work associated with community benefit agreements, this is the real work, because a target is just a number. It could be a great number, but to actually engage the community networks, the social enterprises, the community organizations, and the people that are trying to progress at a socioeconomic level, needs a lot of hard work and commitment. And we don't necessarily see that tied into the agreements because it's outside of the procurement process. But that investment from Employment Ontario, in the Ontario context, the Employment Ontario funded agencies, the local community centers, those who have the actual like trusting built relationship with individuals living in a community that are from equity seeking and deserving groups, they're the big players. And that's where we pivot. And we really need to ensure that we're working in collaboration with them and they have a relationship with our developers, because that's when employment meets, like the supply of employment meets demand. And there's a big gap over there. Like sometimes it's very easy in year 1 and 2 to get the cream of the crop of people that are ready to be employed. But then when we start talking about people who are facing barriers to entrepreneurial opportunities and employment, then we need to really focus on working with the social workers, the youth workers, the employment agencies. And that's where a lot of real magic takes place, because seeing the private sector step up and come to the table and really lead some of those conversations and hear, really listen to what the advocates and community agencies and people on the ground are saying, and respond to that in a way that's really honest and in a way that meets the needs that people are putting that are bringing forth as barriers to our employment, and creating solutions is very important. So that's a lot of high level talk. Like an actual solution around that is, I've seen some of our developers work with their sub trades to hire people with disabilities, right? And in the trades, that's almost unheard of. But it's that extra time that's taken for the developers to work out actual agreements and having vendors that are willing and open to taking the extra step to supporting people who have challenges with employment. Like, and I say disabilities as one example, but there's a wide number of pre-employment training programs that are needed to support people access jobs. And yes, construction is very, very important, but there's also the developers, and I'm sure Pino, you know this, that you've had to extend out to your beyond, like the engineering firms, your marketing firms, your legal counsel. One thing I challenge the developers is go to your investors, go to the banks and see what they're going to bring to the table, because they're making money off of us in the end. Anyone that's benefiting financially from our projects should be looped in to supporting some sort of benefit for, people that are being impacted by these.
William, you are resonating with so many people. I think just about everybody. Check the chat and you'll see. I think we need like 30 more minutes for this conversation, but alas, we got to end it here. And I just want to thank you, Pino and Alicia and William and April, for, the real talk today. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And let's do this again. Professor Matty, you got 3 minutes to wrap this up. I am so sorry about that, but I know you're a professional. You can get it done. All right, now take care, everybody. And let's just leave Professor Matty to wrap this up.
Thank you, Rosemary. I'll be extremely brief. Wow, what an amazing night of conversation, of learning, and of sharing. Community benefits are really about an ecosystem and about lifting each other up and taking the resources that are being invested in our communities, turning them into action and making sure that they are equally distributed to build a more just city. And for those who are equity seeking, to ensure that they benefit from the growth and change that's happening in their communities and in our city more broadly. Just a few thank yous by way of wrapping up. I want to thank all of our partners who have made tonight's event possible, the Atkinson Foundation, the Canadian Urban Institute, York University City Institute, University of Toronto School of Cities, and the City Building Center at the university that was formerly known as Ryerson. I want to thank our speakers for your thoughts, your insights, and your passion to build inclusive cities and a more sustainable and just economy. Thanks to Rosemary Powell and the Toronto Community Benefits Network for your facilitation, for your inspiring this series, and for all of your amazing work. And lastly, many thanks to our audience for attending, for your questions, and for your comments. Together, we will learn, we will create knowledge, and that knowledge will lead to a more equitable city. We hope that you found tonight's event enjoyable and educational. Thank you everyone for attending tonight. All the best.